To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
Okay, well, Nick, here we are on the second episode of June 1944, the great month that everybody has been waiting for here in the Channel Islands. We're going to go in at the 10th of June and we're going to take it day by day, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. It's so much going on in June, hence why we split it into two parts. And I think that kind of makes sense. It flows quite nicely.
Yes, and of course, the long-awaited month has arrived, and the initial few days were very, very exciting, and people were almost drunk on expectation. But of course, now people are beginning to think, well, what actually is this likely to bring? But this, I think, will come out from day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we skip back to the 10th of June, so slightly before where we finished last time, we're looking at Ambrose Robbins' diary, who we remember was civil servant, fairly senior civil servant. And he's talking about what's going on because there's been a massive crackdown following D-Day. They're stopping people from loitering around and they're really enforcing. I mean, they had those rules in place anyway, groups of people standing around chatting, but they're really starting to enforce that now because they're just nervous about what's going on. Are people plotting against them? You know, is there going to be some sort of trouble? And they also fear that there might be signalling to Allied aircraft from people on the ground, which we've seen that before. They've also just sentenced several islanders to 2 to 3 months for contributing to illegal wireless distribution. That's the guys from Guns who were into going to trouble for that.
Yes, I see that in our notes we've got Gestapo sentences several islanders, but I think this is Gestapo light.
Yeah, this is the constant theme that we see through the diaries, that they get referred to as the Gestapo, but it's the German secret field police who aren't the Gestapo. We didn't have the Gestapo in the islands, but it is quite frequently a term used by the people at the time because that's what they considered to be the Gestapo.
Slightly secret police.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think they kind of modelled themselves a little bit on them.
Yeah.
I mean, but they can hear all the heavy bombing in France. You know, it's constant. They can see the flashes. They can hear naval gunfire, etc., from Normandy.
Yes, and the Allies seem to be chasing the submarine around.
Yeah, there's a damaged submarine. It gets attacked off of Sark. It pitches up in Guernsey. It's damaged. It gets attacked various points throughout June whilst it's in Guernsey, and it gets moved around the island a little bit as well. In fact, at one point, it gets bombed. They don't realise that the submarine is no longer in what is now the Victoria Marina, and drop a 500-pound bomb there, which blows out the windows on pretty much everything along the seafront there, as well as damaging the stained glass windows at the town church. The submarine clears off around to Fermain area and then eventually disappears. It gets sunk, I think it's about the 30th of June, somewhere completely from here. Some of the sailors nearly came a cropper on that boat anyway, because there's an account which I found in the Imperial War Museum archive from one of the Germans who says that he went off for a few drinks. He must have gone up to St. Martin's from the description, but I can't quite figure out where. And
to a bar. I reckon that might have been the Auberge de Vet, which is no longer with us.
Well, maybe. He wandered up from the submarine, and as he was wandering back, slightly drunk, back towards town, he decided to go and stand in the field and have a comfort break, shall we say, and then almost got shot by a German patrol. So, but generally speaking, there weren't that many Germans running around the place other than on official duty, so he's probably chancing his arm anyway.
Yeah, well, it might well have been Georgian troops, because Georgian troops were stationed up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Another interesting point, of course, is because telephones become unreliable or not available at all, people are happy to sort of rely on letters and face-to-face to tell each other things.
Yeah, exactly. They can't actually get through at the telephone exchange, and there's a number of reasons for that. Firstly, the Germans have taken over the telephone exchange because they want to use them for military purposes, but also they're worried about if islanders have got access to the telephone system, then if there is an Allied landing, they're going to be able to tip people off or phone, ring ahead and say, there's been a landing and it might lead to more trouble, or at the very least assisting the Allied forces. So that causes massive problems because nobody can phone anyone.
And this is a tactic on behalf of Germans. It's not broken communications, it's deliberate severance.
It was deliberate. They started off with basically saying that they were going to lock all of the staff from the telephone exchanges in the telephone exchanges, which eventually got negotiated down to they would be escorted to there and back, and that there would be a guard on duty at the exchanges. So that made life pretty difficult for people.
Okay, so there's lots and lots of bombing on the French coast, all visible and audible to people
very much
in the Channel Islands. It's almost like having a seat at the edge of the arena. And there's lots and lots of vessels going backwards between the islands, and certainly still the coast of France, I think, at this stage. But they're very, very vulnerable to attack. And I think the Germans are losing.
Yeah, they're losing a few boats along the way. The typhoons that we talked about in the previous episode, they're running around the area, attacking it, enemy shipping. It's very hazardous. Some boats from France do come here because they're trying to get away from the Allies. Whether that was a good idea or not is a matter. I mean, there were a couple of minesweepers that get sunk, and Belgian pilot who was flying a Typhoon gets killed when it crash lands in Jersey on the 14th. But the Germans are losing things like M-class minesweepers sunk after being attacked off of Cap de la Harguette. And that, again, is either they're being attacked by air, but the British have also got motor torpedo boats that are whizzing around the area attacking things.
And the RAF Robin reports hit an ammunition ship. That must have been quite spectacular.
Yeah, I can imagine. That would have been quite a big bang.
So on the 15th, there's a major attack on St. Peter Port Harbour. So we must stress this is the harbour area. Diarist Reverend Ord reports multiple waves, considerable German casualties, and also this is confirmed, or rather the raids are confirmed in other diaries, Ruth Ozan's diaries, and of course Ambrose Sherwood's.
Ambrose Robbins.
Sorry, Ambrose Sherwood, do beg your pardon.
The ammunition ship's still burning from the previous.
Yeah. And of course, going back to telephones, of course, it means that doctors and fire brigade, even the island's bee man can't be contacted because he's required to collect swarms of bees. This is something that took me quite by surprise.
Not really something I'd considered being a major issue. Tomatoes banned from export. Well, you're hardly likely to be trying to export them.
No, and it's just something that one of the the tomato exports, of course, would have been just to France, but nothing like that had been previously. Where we're recording at the moment was a binary, and that had closed down.
Always already worried about what's going on in terms of their rations and how things are going to look. He's worried about already by the 15th. So we're only talking 9 days after D-Day. He's worried about the poor German supplied cuts of meat. I mean, it's a tiny meat ration anyway, and a tiny supplement of local meat. They do issue some wood to households without fuel, but again, it's tiny amounts.
Yeah, so this is people that haven't got gas to cook on.
Yeah.
Well, the only way is to light a fire using wood, maybe chuck some coal on if you've got it, and then put a saucepan on top of the fire. My grandmother must have had to cook that way.
Well, gas becomes a problem as well a little bit later on, because Ord talks about the fact that the gas man came around to cut the gas off because the Germans had got so fed up of people circumventing the gas restrictions that they decided the only way that they could stop people from using more gas than they were allowed was to stop them using any gas whatsoever.
Yes.
So they just came around and cut you off.
Yeah, so this is people using gas outside of the hours they should have done. Yeah. Okay, we move further into the...
There's one more from the 15th as well, Ruth.
This was really tickled me.
Notes a new slang for local girls pregnant by Germans. They're being referred to as troop carriers, which obviously shows a bit of a sentiment.
Yes, June of 1944, one has to say that my great aunt was a troop carrier by 3 months at that point.
But... there's more shipping gets sunk as well. An armed trawler gets sunk in St. Peter Port Harbour on the 15th. Ord goes down to have a look at the damage around the area from both the attack on the previous day and from that he's been stopped.
Yes, because police are moving people on. They don't want people looking upon the devastation.
Yeah, they've been made by the Germans basically to move people on and stop gazing at what's going on. Yeah, the German patrol boat V205 sank in Speedport Harbour after the air raid. Amazingly, in May 1945, it was refloated, repaired, and returned to Germany and continued as a fishing boat until it got used for weapons testing in 1954, and it eventually got scrapped into still. I've got a couple of photos of that, but it was basically sunk right there where the very first ro-ro ramp was, next door to the terminal there. It must have been a massive obstruction for them. Looking at where it was sunk, there was quite a lot of damage at Fort George as well because that had been attacked. And again, diarists talk about many casualties. It's very difficult to know exactly how many casualties.
Yeah, you've got a great photograph here of which I guess you can put up on.
Yeah, I can put it on the session. Of
this damage. This is the damaged ship, presumably, with a Castle Cornet in the background.
In the background.
Terrific photograph.
It looks slightly different to the way it looks today because it's still got the old barracks in there.
Yeah. Okay, so we see that in civilian matters, there's another step in the ever-tightening now rationing regime. Things are going to start getting really tight, aren't they?
Yeah. We're talking. This is the point where we mentioned the gas valve. Over in Jersey, Lesotho is talking about heavy air activity and that the hospitals are overwhelmed with the wounded. And we remember that in the previous episode, we were talking about the fact that the nurses from the German hospital were trying to get off the island.
Yes,
D-Day was starting. So,
yes.
yeah.
So Lesotho ration cuts announced, which is going to be bread, meat and salt. Now, the Americans reportedly are taken, at this point, this is the 17th of June, Unterborg, which is important because it brings Jersey's coastal batteries, German coastal batteries on Jersey, within range of US forces and vice versa. Now, I don't think the US forces the Allies were ever going to start bombarding the islands from France, but the Germans, of course, would have sort of said to themselves, is it worth taking a pot shot at the Allies?
Well, they may well have thought that, but they may also have been thinking, well, might the Allies start shooting artillery at us? Who knows? They may not have considered the fact that the Allies wouldn't do that because they wouldn't want the civilian casualties.
No, so the Germans would have been, so they would have said to themselves, we can now reach the Allies in France, but we won't do anything because they would have feared retribution, basically. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, on the 18th, we hear the Americans reaching Carteret. Huge detonations and naval gunfire is heard from Guernsey. German casualties taken to the underground hospital in St. Martin's. And, I mean, do we have any sort of perspective on the amount of casualties? It's been very difficult, isn't it?
It's very difficult to establish exactly how many casualties there were.
So there's casualties on island, but there's also casualties.
Yeah, a lot of it's
coming from France.
Yeah, it's a lot of them are coming either from France or they've become casualties on shipping.
Yes, in transit. Yeah. Here we are hearing, as we mentioned before, the damaged submarine moves along to Fermain Bay, Pine Forest area. That's along Guernsey's south coast. It's a cliff area, and we heard about our sailor friend before. There was a few little pubs along there in those days, so it's interesting to think he might have visited those. In Louis Guillemet's diary, he mentions that 2 British warships are sighted in 4 years to be seen from the island by civilians, and they are fired upon. These British warships are fired upon by the Germans, but the British warships make smoke and disappear behind their smoke screen. But it must have been quite a morale boost for people to see these, the Royal Navy, after all these years. And again, overhead, constant aircraft noise, nearly all Allied. There's no German activity to speak of at all, is there?
Not really in terms of aircraft flying around. There's so much in the way of Allied aircraft in the area because they're attacking the Cherbourg Peninsula. Obviously, if the Americans by this point have reached Carteret, they're working their way down the peninsula. But it does take some time because it takes until the middle of August before they get as far as St. Malo down in Britain.
Yes, and the taking of St. Malo was quite a feat, but that's a story for another day.
That's a story for another day, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry?
Dock workers start...
Yes, I was going to get... This is an interesting story.
They start refusing to unload German cargo and they get arrested. And the Germans are are getting increasingly intolerant of what is described as passive resistance. So basically just refusing to do stuff. And these guys get into quite a bit of trouble over this. There's another air raid on the harbour nearby, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Idiot's Delight was the name of the boat, was hit by flak from oil and ditched into the sea. Lesotho talks about the incessant fighting being audible, and of course Jersey's much, much closer to Castlereagh than Guernsey is. And he talks about that he's heard unverified rumours of US airmen landing on the island. But Ambrose Robbins again talks about the major damage in town and an unexploded bomb discovered. So it's certainly not a great time to be around town. It's at this point that the Germans suddenly decide that they'd been occupying quite a few properties in the Havelet area and around the Strand and all along there, and they decided maybe it's not such a great idea. So they pretty much moved out of that area completely.
Okay, we also hear that this is in Guernsey, that local men aged 18 to 25 are ordered to report to German headquarters here. Actually, it's put forward that this is for forced labour, facing German troops that have redeployed for defence and extra guard duties and things. Is this going against the Hague Convention?
Yeah, it would be, yeah. But who knows? I don't remember anything specific about this. I think it was just one of their panic measures. Anybody 18 to 25, they were probably more likely wanting to know how many there were without having to go through all the ID cards and stuff.
Yeah.
And that might kick off because they are really worried that the civilian population in all of the islands are likely to. There's a number of concerns. They're concerned about the Georgians.
Yeah.
That they might kick off. And we've already talked about the fact that they have their sidearms taken away. They're only allowed to man the artillery guns. And broadly speaking, that they're viewed with a good deal of suspicion. The Italians that are deemed to be still on the side of the Germans and get to wear the special armband that shows that they're an Italian, but they're on the German side because they've said they'll still fight for them, are also viewed with a great deal of suspicion in that they might change their mind about what their allegiance is going to be and also might join in any form of uprising that might.
So the Germans could have, and possibly sound as if they did, really fear maybe a certain sort of military-led mutiny of Georgian Italian troops with locals taking part.
Yeah, or German, or actually Germans, they were worried internally. Down in Jersey, there is, slightly later on, there's a real talk about that there might be an uprising of German troops, and that's fomented by the Jersey Communist Party. Involved in that with some disaffected Germans. It never comes to be, but that's later on in the occupation.
But you can see the Germans have got a lot to worry about. Even if some of these worries are imaginary, they're still going to worry about.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and they just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we talked about in the first part, all talking about them running around digging up trenches for no apparent reason in really stupid places where you absolutely wouldn't need a trench, but it's just like, well, let's keep the men busy kind of thing. Or I don't know, they would just taken. I think they were convinced that the Allies were going to try and take the islands back by force. There's lots of bombing going on. The Allies are being relatively careful as to timing of their attacks and where they attack, because they are very mindful of not wanting to cause massive civilian casualties. I mean, that's not a good look if you're liberating the island by bombing the living daylights out of it. That's not to say that later on in the war there weren't plans that if they had to retake them by force, you're going to have 3 days of bombing with 700 aircraft. There wouldn't be many people left after that, I don't think.
And I would say Ord speculates that the Americans actually might try to take Alderney to silence the batteries, and we would remind listeners, of course, that there would be no civilian collateral damage if they did that. Well, being no civilians of any number.
There were a few, but not a huge amount. I mean, of course, Alderney does get attacked, but not by the US, by HMS Rodney, but that's not for another.
The other thing, of course, that does occur when you look at the care that the Allies seem to have taken about not harming civilians in the Channel Islands, they didn't seem to have too much problem in France. I mean, I think Caen there were about 5,000 casualties on D-Day itself.
Yeah.
So do we think that they may have viewed French civilians as more expendable than Channel Islanders?
No, I don't think.
I think it's really locality.
So. It's just
strategy-led.
It's just the case that they've got to bomb. It's the only way that they're going to be able to retake France.
It's different imperatives.
Different motives. But yeah, I mean, it was absolutely terrible the amount of people that were killed. But how do you retake France without an aerial campaign? It's going to be very difficult. Not impossible. I mean, the Germans lose a few aircraft around here as well. There's a Heinkel HE-111 crashes at Samaray in Jersey on the 20th. Later talks about a German aircraft flying over, and he thinks they're dropping ammunition
to local troops.
To local troops to resupply them is what he thinks is happening, and he talks about them being fired on and doesn't really know what's going on.
Oh, blue on blue fire.
But then again, there's also talk in Guernsey about rumours of ammunition being dropped from aircraft by the Allies who have got lost and were supposed to be dropping it to the French. So who knows? This one's an interesting one. Ord receives a lift in a car for the first time in 3 years. Passengers are normally forbidden.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing not to go in a car for 3 years. Something we can't get our head around. The first reports, of course, of V1 bombings in the south of England start to reach the islands. People still listening to the BBC, of course. This sort of new secret weapon is confirming the fears that Hitler may have secret weapons. He's demonstrated he has, and this must have had a psychological effect on people here. They must have worried, I suppose, that these doodlebugs or V1s could be deployed against the island.
Yeah.
Or, maybe the Americans have got something similar. All of these rumours start get rumours.
Because they can hear these things described, but they don't know what they look like.
Yeah. My mother lived in London during the war and lots of accounts of V1s and V2s. Now, a German vessel, this is on the 21st, is reportedly sunk with 200 people aboard. And I think, is this going to be connected to what we're going to come on to about the prisoners that have left Alderney? Or is this a separate issue?
I'm not quite sure. This was unconfirmed, and I can't find anything for that day.
Possibly a rumour.
So the one we're going to talk about later on actually is ends up getting sunk in July. But and again, Lesotho talks in his diary actually about the Heinkel again that crashed in Jersey. And he said, it crashed in flames and the crew were casualties. And also on the 21st of June, they were having a good day. A German bomber was hit by flak from a St. Peterborough flagship and crashed with all 5 of the crew dying. Going back to our dock worker friends, by the 21st, because they've been refusing to enter the port, they've been labelled as cowards and accused of neglect of duty. This is all talking about them. It's pretty harsh for him. He's, a man of the cloth and usually fairly sees the best in people and fairly even-handed. But I'm thinking he's probably worried about the fact that there won't be any supplies. It's going to cause massive hardship.
Okay, so we also have this reported on the 23rd through Louis Guillemette, who's was Guernsey's liaison between Guernsey government and the German field commandant, is that he hears that the Germans have been ordered to fight to the last man, and Louis fears thousands of civilian casualties if the islands become a battleground. So is there an official order that's been found that the Germans were?
I've not seen any of that. I'm sure that would have been the case, but because the way things were going, the order would have come from France.
Yeah.
And we know that when Hofmeier takes over later on, he says to the bailiff of Jersey, I'll be holding out until you and I are eating grass.
Yeah. Okay, we come across this account from Ord and others about these political prisoners that are taken from Alderney and are in transit. It eventually appears, and they appear in Guernsey, and Ord is with a postman, I think, outside his house in the Rohays, which is sort of the suburbs of St. Peterborough. And he mentions these 1,000 or so political prisoners being marched through with these striped pajama-type uniforms that we're used to seeing on the documentaries and such. Shaved heads, many barefoot. Some with just wooden sabots on, others, with bandages and such. SS guards with machine pistols and guard dogs. SS, well, they would have been part of the SS. Yeah. Ord says the prisoners shuffled past silently. Some do wave at windows, and I think some flash V signs. But he says that the stench of the unwashed bodies linger all days. Now, what he wrote is that these people were herded down into the fields near Whitewoods, Whitewoods area, and were just sort of left out overnight.
Quite possibly, because there was a camp there for the organisation top.
There was one at Rue Sauvage, one down at Whitewoods. Yeah,
there was. Well, it was where the KG5 is now. Quite likely that they would put them in a field nearby. Ruth Ozan says she thinks they were a mix of Soviet POWs and political prisoners. In reality, they were a mix of various nationalities, a great deal of Russians and Ukrainians, and political prisoners. She's probably referring to the Spanish who were forced to go and work there as well.
I don't think it was the only group either. I mean, there's another, I think on another day, another column I've seen, which are about 1,400 people. Is it likely that they would have brought as many people over in batches like that?
Yeah, they were trying to pull them out of Alderney to go and work in France on the Atlantic Wall, so they wanted to get them out of there. I mean, it's also unfortunate that at this point there's quite a lot of stormy weather, so they get stuck here for a few days. Ambrose Robbins talks about the fact that it's very stormy, and that due to all the bomb damage that's been occurring, the church services are having to be combined. At this point, the town church is off limits, and certainly the forest church as well was not allowed to be used for quite some time.
These prisoners were transshipped then to Jersey and then on to St. Malo. Now, the German ship SS Minotaur enters the story, and you have written about this in your book that we're pleased to announce is now available.
Yeah, my book is now available. It's a Defiance. You can get it from Barnthorne Publishing's website or from direct from Amazon. It will be available locally very shortly. I'm just waiting on a large box of books to arrive. But yeah, the SS Minotaur, as we mentioned just now, there was quite a lot of bad weather at this point. The Minotaur didn't come here, as far as I can tell. It was used from Jersey to take these poor people to France. It did get torpedoed in July with very heavy casualties. I mean, it produced a headline, which I still can't fathom out how the Daily Mirror was allowed to print this in the UK. But shortly afterwards, Daily Mirror, and I've looked for other newspapers in the newspaper archive to see if they published anything like this story, and they didn't. So I don't know if it's just that it got through censorship, somebody missed it and it got through to the Daily Mirror, but the headline was 500 Jersey Islanders torpedoed trying to escape, which would have been very worrying for anybody that was
very irresponsible.
And it's only got a couple of column inches, just enough to really worry you. You know, why anybody thought that was a good idea to put in the paper, I really not got any idea. But we'll talk about that one a bit more in July, because that's more relevant to what happens then. But I've got a fairly lengthy account of what happened on that boat, because actually, whilst there weren't 500 Jersey Islanders trying to escape on that boat, there were two people who were trying to escape using that boat, although neither of them knew that the other was on the boat.
So this is what features in your book.
Yeah, and it's in the book. But we'll talk a little bit. I won't give the whole game away in July when we get to the July episode, but I'll give you a bit of a flavour of how that one pans out. I mean, there's constant naval clashes going on. Lesoto's talking about this. Naval clashes off of the coast of Jersey in anticipation of Cherbourg's fall, because we have to remember, at this point, although they're working their way down the Cherbourg Peninsula, they haven't managed to take Cherbourg, the port itself. And the Germans basically are holding out with the view to, if they are going to have to give up Cherbourg port, then they're going to make sure it's not in a fit state to be used by the Allies for quite some time without having to have quite a lot of work done to it. But aside from the slave workers, Ord talks about town being full of foreign workmen and women, likely in transit from Alderney or Cherbourg to St. Malo. I don't think they were coming from Cherbourg at this point.
No,
way too risky.
Yeah, and German discipline seems to be weakening. We could perhaps draw a distinction between discipline and morale. Possibly both are, but even it seems to civilian onlookers that the Germans themselves, their discipline is perhaps not as together as it would have been.
Correct. They're reported as being quite slovenly and lax in their behaviour. Probably half of them are wondering, thinking, "God, it's nearly over."
Yeah.
Hoping that, the islands are going to surrender, but we know that's not the case. The bad weather continues. Lesotho talks about the rain and bad weather is bringing a bit of a lull in the fighting. Wounded are brought ashore in Jersey, and Ambrose Robbins talking about small raids have been taking place around the island there. He means air raids in that.
Yeah.
And all this getting increasingly worried about food pressure from the new arrivals who are coming in. There's no new supplies of food coming in. We've got all these people who have just appeared and not at this point, not knowing how long they're going to be here. So that's going to be a worry for him as well.
Yes, that's right. But Louis Guillemet, who is well placed, probably more so than any other of our diarists, he reports that there's a growing belief amongst the Germans and civilians here that no Allied landing will occur on the islands. So I think that fear of battles on the island for the moment may have receded. And Louis says that there is a sort of consensus forming that liberation will only come after the continental battles are decided.
Yeah.
Now, whether he means unconditional surrender, as we know it eventually turned out, or maybe perhaps the fighting moves out of France into the Low Countries, and he thinks then maybe, because nobody knows.
Nobody knows, but certainly some of the accounts that I've read, a lot of people thought as soon as basically they'd taken the Cherbourg Peninsula and moved on down into Brittany, then there was a good chance, or certainly they hoped that there was a good chance that the islands would surrender. Now, they were working on the basis that you had somebody sane in charge. Now, von Schmettau, who was the commandant responsible for the Channel Islands, was quite sane. But, of course, Hofmeier's arrived and is in the background, and von Schmettau's already in trouble for being seen as being too lax on the local populations. And Hofmeier's main job is to keep an eye on him. And so von Schmettau's not being able to be as lax as, perhaps lax is not the wrong word, but he was reluctant to do anything that he viewed as being unreasonable or potentially in breach of the Hague Convention or whatever, unless he was absolutely forced to do it. And of course, Hofmeier gets in charge and he's wanting to hold out to the last man. I mean, March 45, he launches a flipping commando raid. Yeah.
Well, he was a Nazi.
He was a
died in the wall.
A died in the wall Nazi, and yeah.
So he's been sort of parachuted in to stiffen.
Well, he had been he was in the Navy. He was
Admiral Hofmeier, wasn't he?
Vice Admiral Hofmeier. Yeah, he'd been in the Navy. Let's say he wasn't very good at being a captain of a ship. He was in charge of the Scharnhorst at one point.
Oh, right. Okay, that's significant command.
Yeah.
But not for long.
But he was not liked by his crews at all. They had various nicknames for him. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I do remember thinking that some of them were quite funny. But basically, he had various accidents with ships. I'm not sure that he actually managed to sink any Allied shipping whilst he was a captain of any of these ships. But he caused damage to various ships that he was captain of. He basically got shipped off to sort of head up a unit that was responsible for political indoctrination, basically, because he was an armed Nazi. So they kind of moved him over to going to do that. Then when they got concerns here about von Schmettau and how things were going here, is he being too lenient on the civilian populations of the islands, Hofmeier finds himself shipped over here and then very quickly works around, basically getting von Schmettau shipped off the island, allegedly for ill health. But, it was more likely because he wanted to take control. And he was, as I say, ardent Nazi, thought that he made these ridiculous statements in 45 about they will come for us, not meaning the Allies coming to invade. He meant, someone's going to come and rescue us from Germany. Who? Where? How?
Yeah.
No idea. I mean, you had rallies in Jersey, in the museum, in the cinema rather, in Jersey in 45. Completely.
Yeah. Von Schmettau was also an interesting character. It was his second tour of duty here, I think. He was the nephew of von Rundstedt, who a lot of people have heard of course. Richard Hume, who is the owner of the Guernsey Occupation Museum, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary. And he gave a speech at the celebrations the other day, Nick, and he mentioned that von Schmettau visited Guernsey in the 60s, incognito, all very quietly with his wife, and Richard found out, someone tipped Richard off, and Richard went and interviewed him and spoke with him. So I don't think we could class von Schmettau as a Nazi.
No, very much. Von Schmettau writes to the bailiff of Jersey.
Yes, that's right.
Whilst he is a prisoner in a prison war camp, to inquire about the people of Jersey and how they fared, writing in quite warm terms. I'm not sure if he wrote to the bailiff here. I've not seen a copy of any letter to evidence that. When he went to Jersey in the 60s, he was interviewed by Channel TV.
Yes, and Hofmeyr, in contrast, will feature in our run out now towards liberation. But would you say, Nick, that really at the end of June 1944, we enter another phase, really, don't we, in the sort of run-up to liberation? I think we're in a sort of phase now, July through to the eventual arrival of Red Cross supplies in December 44. We're in another sort of staging post through to December. We see this grip of privation really take hold in the island. Food shortages are hugely exacerbated over this period because of.
You've already had a really bad run of food rationing getting stricter. Then you get a few supplies in and stuff. So they've had a bad winter over 43, early 44 already, and it's really taking its toll on people. And then things just go from bad to worse. In terms of aircraft landing at the airport, I don't think, certainly in Guernsey, that they didn't, shortly after D-Day till middle of October 44, the next German aircraft landed at the airport in terms of one coming in with anything from mainland Europe. You know, they're pretty much cut off from that. Shipping's getting massively attacked. Germans are blaming the Allies for the fact that there is all these food shortages, but the weather's also playing its part as well, because the political prisoners and slave workers are basically stuck here for a few more days because the weather's just too bad. In Jersey, Lesotho's talking about mock defence exercise alarms going on and people running around like lunatics.
Yeah, well, my father, who would have been 10, 1944, I always remember him talking a number of times about this period where German troops would just run through the house in these exercises. And he said what he remembers was they literally did have blacked out faces and bits of shrubbery attached to their helmets and such, you know. And for a 10-year-old boy, it must have been, I would think, more frightening than exciting. Yeah, I mean, it was as I said, we've come to this sort of over the two parts of this June 1944 in this podcast. And it's a pivotal month, obviously. But July, as we will go through in July, we will see, presumably, a continuation of the privations. We have, I think, a significant diary on the horizon. Van Alpers, his diary. And, of course, he will give us a great insight into Hofmeyr.
Yes, he doesn't hold back in some of his descriptions of some of his fellow German officers and various other people throughout out there, including Louis. And
yes. So we get the German perspective in these right up to 1945, May 45, and it gives us a wonderful view on how some of the Germans view some of the Germans. And, of course, in a general scheme of things, Van Alpers, what was his sort of, let's give it a slight preview here. He was a significant appointment to the islands, wasn't he? He was an officer of some standing.
Yes, he was, albeit when the bomb plot against Hitler happens, there is some suspicion that he might have known something about it.
And that's July 44.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think his wife gets arrested.
We'll come to that in due course.
We'll come to that. But yeah, I mean, there's a fantastic book of the diaries which John Nettles put together, which is a really good read. I mean, we've got to remember he was a baron as well, so he's nobility,
aristocrat.
Yeah, and an aristocrat, rather. So
he had a slight disdain for and contempt for the regime, I think we can say.
Yeah, I think so. He was a very interesting character, shall we say? Well, we'll get on to quite how important his exact role when we get to talking about him. He was based in Jersey for a while, and he seemed to have a bit of a dislike for Claude Cahun, and I'm trying to think what the other lady.
These are the two French artists that were
more, yeah.
Yes,
they end up in prison. I was in Jersey at the weekend, actually, and if you're listening and you're in Jersey or you're visiting Jersey scene, if you go to Jersey museums in St Helier, they've got they're projecting onto the wall in there some of the pictures that the two artists created and some of the photographs that they took. And it's really quite an interesting thing to see. They've also got a picture of Claude Cahun coming out of prison on the day she's released. A German soldier had given her badges for his uniform, and she's biting the eagle. Photograph, she's biting the eagle as an act of defiance of his.
Yes, there are a couple that are very, very interesting. There's been fictionalized accounts of their life in Jersey. There's been a couple of plays written, and they're both buried in St Prelard's churchyard, I believe.
Yeah, I believe so, yeah. But yeah, very, very interesting characters. I also took the opportunity, I'd never, to my shame, never been to the Jersey War Tunnels, their underground hospital. So I put that right at the weekend as well. Really, really good. Highly recommend going and take a visit there.
Okay, so we reached the end of June 1944, I think. We look forward to the next phase. So I see, Nick, personally, that the occupation plays out in two further phases. One is from now to the end of 44. In other words, when the starvation and malnutrition really bite, we lose another one of our family during that period. But then once the Red Cross parcels have arrived and we enter 1945, the civilians' fear of starvation is to some degree lightened. But the Germans, of course, don't get the same amount of increase in rations or anything. And so we sort of see the Germans faring very, very badly, but the civilians possibly a little better off. But these will play out in the ensuing months.
And of course, in September 44, we get the attempt to get the Germans to surrender, which that we might end up having to do a two-parter on that one, because that's quite a long but well worth telling story.
Well, we could do a special on that.
Yeah. While we're talking about specials and things like that, I actually recorded with Chris Oliver yesterday, friend of mine who is very much involved in the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry Memorial Trust. And he said perhaps we could record something to talk about the RGLI. And we thought about it, and there's a lot of impact from what happened in the First World War, or the Wrong War, as I called it, before I got a stare and and Liz Walton also pointed out to me that it was not the wrong war, it was the interesting one. And that's another thing, we must get Liz on to talk about some of the stuff that she's researched. I'll have to give her a shout. Chris and I talked about how the impact of the RGLI going off to France, and both the social and economic impacts of that, and how that flowed through right until the occupation, and to be fair, during the occupation, because of what had gone before and how that impacted people. So we'll be sticking that out as a special where we talk about both wars, but most predominantly about the first. Chris knows a heck of a lot about it, I must confess. I was amazed at some of the stuff that he was able to.
Yeah, the Channel Islands in the First World War is a story waiting to be told properly. Liz Walton yesterday on Twitter put just a whole list of things that people probably didn't know about, and I looked and went, yeah, I knew about two of those things, but I didn't know about the rest of that. Yeah.
So yeah, that would be great. So we'll be putting that one out with Chris sometime soon.
So your book is now available. Yeah, if you'd like to remind listeners what it's called.
Tides of Defiance. It's all about the escapes from the Channel Islands. You can get it from Amazon. It's hopefully available on Amazon worldwide. Certainly, I know some people have ordered it in America from Amazon in the States, or you can get it from Barn Thorne Publishing if you just Google that. Yeah, so quite busy. I've just qualified a silver accredited tour guide.
I think you got a notification just in the last few days.
Yeah, last couple of days.
So you, like me, a silver accreditation. Yeah. You're ready to take tours?
Yes, indeed. I'm off doing one this afternoon, actually, which...
So you're available, like myself. I tended to step back a little bit because I've got so much else on, but you're available. People can contact you and book private tours, can't they, Nick?
Yes.
So could people have your contact details?
Yeah, sure. If you go to my website, islandfortress.com, the contact details are on there, and feel free to get in touch with me.
And I think if people were significantly interested, they could also perhaps hire us both at some time if they wanted to meet up with us. So people do come out to Port Grey, where I'm stationed for Guernsey Museum Services. But I think Nick is the one that's going to be most available. His knowledge of the occupation period far exceeds mine. So Nick would be an absolutely wonderful addition to the Guild of Accredited Guides. It's very, very, very highly trained and very knowledgeable. So, anyone coming to Guernsey, feel free to contact us, occupied@gnetradio.com, or the details that Nick has just given.
I'll put a link on the show notes so that people can find that as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think we possibly are done for June 1944. So. Okay.
Off out to enjoy the sunshine.
Yeah, I'm off to BBC now to do a little bit on William the Conqueror, so a different invasion.
It's totally different.
Okay, thank you for listening, everybody. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye from me.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew